The sound comes before the light, a low, trembling vibration that you feel in your chest before your ears can name it. It moves through the stone floors, up through the soles of your sandals, into your bones. You wake in the dark of your home, a narrow house pressed between the harbor and the old forum, and for a moment you do not know what it is. Then your wife reaches for your arm. Your children have already gathered in the doorway, silent in a way that only children are when they have sensed that the adults cannot protect them. You go to the window. The sky over the western walls is the color of a bruise. It is Tuesday, the 29th of May. The year is 1453. The guns of Sultan Mehmed II have been firing for 55 days. You know the sound by now. You have learned to measure the intervals between the thunder and the impact. You have learned which parts of the city absorb the blows and which do not. You have learned to live inside a siege the way people learn to live inside a long illness, with routine, with denial, with the terrible mathematics of hope. But tonight, the sound is different. Tonight, there is no interval. Tonight, it does not stop. You look toward the walls, those ancient, sacred walls that have stood for more than 1,000 years, and you see torches moving along the ramparts like a broken string of fire. You hear, beneath the cannon, another sound, a sound that swells and rolls and does not belong to machinery or stone. It belongs to human throats. Tens of thousands of human throats, all crying out at once in a language that is not yours. And somewhere inside you, in the place where faith and reason go when they can no longer hold each other up, you already know. The city is falling. But here is the question that history almost never asks. Not the dates, not the dynasties, not the geopolitical calculations of empire meeting empire above the Bosphorus. The question that deserves to be asked, slowly in the dark, is this: what was it like to be the person at that window? What was it like to be alive inside the final hours of a civilization that had survived 11 centuries of siege, plague, schism, and catastrophe, only to arrive at this particular Tuesday morning and to know at last that the thing which was supposed to be eternal was ending? That is what we are going to find out. What you need to understand, what changes the meaning of everything that follows, is that the fall of Constantinople was not simply the defeat of a city, it was the erasure of a world. Constantinople, in the spring of 1453, was the last living heart of the Eastern Roman Empire. The empire that had once stretched from Britain to the Tigris River, the empire whose legal codes still shaped European law, whose art still hung in the churches of Venice and Ravenna, whose scholars had preserved the manuscripts of Aristotle, Plato, Euclid, and Homer through centuries of Western darkness. That empire, by 1453, had been reduced to a single city and a handful of outlying territories. But it was still the city, Constantinopolis, the city of Constantine, the second Rome, the city that had been founded in 330 AD as the new capital of a united empire, that had outlasted the western half by 1,000 years, that had held its walls against Avars and Arabs, Bulgars and Crusaders, plague and internal rebellion, and the long, grinding pressure of Ottoman expansion pressing from every direction across 3 generations. The city that fell on that Tuesday morning was the last standing structure of the ancient world in the medieval present. When it fell, a door closed between 2 eras of human civilization, and the closing of that door was heard in different ways across the known world. But to understand what that meant to the people who lived it, you have to go back. You have to stand in Constantinople before the cannons. You have to understand what it felt like to live there when the world still seemed solid beneath your feet.
Walk through the city on a morning in the decade before the siege, and what you encounter is not a city in obvious decline, not to the naked eye, not to the heart. The Hagia Sophia rises against the morning sky with a dome so vast it seems to belong not to architecture, but to geology, as if the mountain simply opened itself into this shape and the builders merely traced the outline. When you enter through the bronze doors and walk into that interior space, the light does the thing it always does. It falls from the 40 windows ringing the base of the dome in long, slanting columns, and the gold mosaic on the ceiling catches it and multiplies it until the whole vast space seems to breathe with luminescence. People who have worshipped there their entire lives still catch their breath. Travelers who have crossed half the known world to see it weep without embarrassment. The markets along the Messe, the great central avenue that cuts the city from the Golden Gate to the Augustion, are dense with the commerce of the world. Genoese merchants argue prices with Armenian traders in a multilingual clamor that no single listener could fully untangle. Silk from China has passed through a dozen hands before it lands in a merchant stall here, and it still commands a price that could feed a craftsman's family for 3 months. Spices from India and the Levant pile in fragrant mountains behind stalls where the merchants know, by long habit, exactly how to measure a Byzantine buyer's interest from across the width of the street. The city smells of bread and fish, of horses and refuse, of salt blown in from the Bosphorus and incense carried from 100 church doorways that open onto the streets at all hours. There are, by some contemporary counts, more than 400 churches within the city walls. They range from the magnificent to the intimate, from monuments of imperial glory to small, dark rooms where a neighborhood gathers in the morning before work and again in the evening after it. Constantinople is a city of memory as much of stone. Every street has a name that carries a story. Every church has a relic or claims one. Every forum has its column or its statue or its ghost, some piece of architectural antiquity around which the living organize their lives. The Hippodrome, though no longer the roaring civic theater it was in the empire's height, still stands as the spine of civic life, its ancient obelisk from Egypt and the serpent column from Delphi rising absurdly side by side, trophies from a world so old that even Constantinople has half forgotten its own role in collecting them. The people who live here are Greek-speaking, Orthodox Christian, and possessed of an identity so layered with history that to ask them simply who they are would require a long answer. They are Roman by inheritance, Greek by language, Christian by faith, and Byzantine by a culture that has evolved over more than a millennium into something entirely its own. They pray with a theological precision that can turn a Tuesday morning liturgy into a meditation on the nature of the divine that would have made Plato recognize kin. And they have always believed, that their city is protected, not merely by walls, though the walls are extraordinary, not merely by geography, though the peninsula between the Golden Horn and the Marmara Sea offers natural advantages that military engineers had envied for 1,000 years. They believe the city is protected by the Theotokos, the Mother of God, whose icon is said to have walked along the walls during the great Arab sieges of the 7th and 8th centuries, and whose intercession is credited with the city's survival through catastrophes that should, by any rational accounting, have ended it centuries before. This is not superstition in the way we sometimes use the word. This is the foundational architecture of a culture's sense of itself. The Byzantines do not distinguish between their religious identity and their civic one. To be a citizen of Constantinople is to be under the protection of the divine. To be under the protection of the divine is to be part of a story that does not end. And yet, even in the city's best days, the structure of Byzantine society is a thing of profound contradiction, elegant on its surface, fragile at its root. At the apex of everything is the emperor, not a king in the Western feudal sense, but something more complex and more theologically charged. The Byzantine emperor is the representative of God on earth, the viceroy of heaven in the temporal realm. His power is theoretically absolute, but in practice it has always been contested, by the aristocracy, by the church, by the factions of the court, and by the army. In the long history of the empire, a surprising number of emperors were blinded, exiled, strangled, or simply marched out of the palace by guards who had changed their allegiance overnight. The throne is radiant and precarious in equal measure. Below the emperor and the court aristocracy is a layered world of merchants, craftsmen, clergy, scholars, and common laborers, whose daily lives are organized around the parish church, the market quarter, and the rhythms of the Orthodox liturgical calendar. A craftsman's week is shaped as much by the feasts and fasts of the church as by the demands of his trade. Lent is not an abstraction, but a physical experience. 40 days of genuine dietary restriction that changes the smell of the city, the mood of its markets, the texture of daily conversation. The church is not merely a spiritual institution. It is an economic power, a social welfare system, a diplomatic actor, and a keeper of records. The Patriarch of Constantinople, the spiritual head of Eastern Orthodoxy, holds a position of influence that operates in constant creative tension with imperial authority. Sometimes the emperor and the patriarch are allies, sometimes they are adversaries, and always beneath their negotiations, the ordinary faithful simply try to live their lives in a way that earns them salvation. What is critical to understand is that by the mid-15th century, the economy of this world has been quietly hollowing out for generations. The Italian city-states, Venice and Genoa especially, have leveraged their naval power and their commercial networks to extract extraordinary economic concessions from successive Byzantine emperors, who needed their ships and their money and their trade routes. The Genoese enclave of Galata, just across the Golden Horn from Constantinople, operates with a degree of economic autonomy that has effectively removed a large segment of Constantinople's commercial activity from Byzantine taxation and control. The city that was once the wealthiest in the Christian world now struggles to maintain its own walls, to pay its own soldiers, to keep its machinery of administration in motion. The population, which at its peak in the 6th century may have numbered 500,000 souls, has fallen, through plague, emigration, political disruption, and the general contraction of Byzantine territory, to somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 people by the time Mehmet's army appears on the horizon. The great city has become, in many neighborhoods, a collection of villages within a wall. There are vast stretches of the interior where gardens and orchards have replaced the dense urban fabric of earlier centuries. The city is haunted by its own dimensions, vast enough to have held an empire, now holding something considerably less. But the bones of it are still magnificent, and the people who live within them still believe.
The force that will end this world did not appear suddenly. It was built, slowly and deliberately, over 3 generations of Ottoman ambition, and it was fed, in no small measure, by the fractures within the Byzantine world itself. The Ottomans had been pressing against the Byzantine Empire for more than a century before the final siege. They had already taken most of Anatolia, the ancient heartland of Byzantine territory on the other side of the Bosphorus. They had pushed into the Balkans, establishing Ottoman control over much of what is now Greece, Bulgaria, and Serbia. By the time Constantine XI became the last Byzantine emperor in 1449, Constantinople was not the center of an empire in any practical sense. It was an island of Byzantine identity in an Ottoman sea, connected to the remaining Byzantine territories in the Peloponnese by a sea route that the Ottomans could sever at will. Mehmed II was 21 years old when he came to the throne in 1451, and the counselors who had managed the empire during his father's later years believed, as counselors often do when faced with a young ruler, that they could manage him. They were wrong in a very specific and consequential way. Mehmed had been thinking about Constantinople since childhood. It was not merely a strategic objective for him, it was a personal obsession, given theological weight by a hadith attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, that a great city would one day fall to a Muslim ruler, and that the ruler who achieved it would be worthy of great honor. Mehmed intended to be that ruler. What he brought to the project was not merely desire, he brought engineering. In particular, he brought the work as a Hungarian cannon maker named Urban, who had first approached Constantinople with an offer to sell his expertise, found the Byzantines unable to meet his price, and walked north across the walls to make the same offer to Mehmed, who paid it without hesitation. Urban's cannons, built to specifications that went beyond anything previously seen, were capable of throwing stone balls weighing hundreds of pounds over distances that made the mathematical relationship between attacker and defender fundamentally different from anything Byzantine military experience had prepared for. The largest of these cannon, called by later chroniclers the Great Bombard, required 60 oxen and several hundred men to transport. It could fire only 7 times a day, but each shot opened the limestone face of the Theodosian walls in ways that, over time, accumulated into something the defenders could not sustain. Before the cannons, Constantinople's walls had been the definitive argument. 3 parallel lines of defense, the outer wall, the terrace, the inner wall, with its towers set at intervals that allowed defenders to cover every approach, had stood for over 1,000 years. Against conventional siege equipment, they were effectively impregnable, but the cannon changed the argument. Not overnight and not with enormous effort from the defenders, but gradually, relentlessly, in the way that new technologies always change the argument when they arrive. And this is where something deeper enters the story, because the Byzantine response to this existential threat was not unified. It was fractured by theology, by politics, by national pride, and by the long, poisonous legacy of the Crusades. The first cannon shot struck the walls on the 6th of April, 1453. In the city, people heard it before they understood it. The sound was unlike anything in their experience, not the sharp crack of a catapult stone, not the grinding of a battering ram.
but a deep, percussive explosion, followed by a sustained trembling that passed through the earth and up through the foundations of every building in the western districts. Church bells, set vibrating by the concussion, rang without hands. In the hours that followed, the defenders on the walls sent word back to the city. The stone facing of the outer wall had been struck. A section had collapsed. It was being repaired. Do not panic. Do not panic. This instruction, repeated in slightly different forms by the emperor's officials throughout the city over the days that followed, became one of the characteristic sounds of the siege. It was not in the beginning dishonest. Constantine XI was a man of genuine courage and genuine intelligence, and his immediate response to the artillery bombardment was to organize the repair crews that would spend the next 55 days filling the breaches each night that the Ottoman guns opened each day. This was not a small achievement. It required materials, labor, coordination, and a civic willingness to work through the night and return to the walls the next morning, knowing that the cannon would fire again at dawn. But the instruction not to panic was also, from the very first day, a form of managed reality. Because the truth, the full, unsparing truth, was that the city had approximately 7,000 defenders against an Ottoman force that contemporary sources place between 80,000 and 150,000 men. The Venetians had provided some ships and some soldiers. A Genoese commander named Giovanni Giustiniani had arrived with a contingent of professional soldiers and had taken command of the wall defenses with a competence that the defenders recognized and were grateful for. But no relief force was coming from the west. The Pope had promised, the Venetian Senate had debated, the letters had been written and the appeals had been made, and no fleet appeared on the horizon. Inside the city, ordinary people lived the siege in the particular way that civilians always live military events, at a remove, through rumor, through the testimony of those who had been to the walls or spoken with the soldiers, through the evidence of their own senses when the earth shook, and the sound rolled over the rooftops, and the bells rang without being touched. The markets stayed open because people still needed to eat. The churches held their services because faith was not optional, and because the liturgy, the daily rhythm of prayer and chant and sacrament, was the structure that kept the interior life from collapse. The neighborhoods closest to the western walls, the Blackernay district and the areas surrounding the Churrisias Gate, emptied first. Families moved their most portable valuables and their youngest children to the neighborhoods on the eastern side of the city, near the Bosphorus shore, where the Ottoman artillery could not reach. The houses they left behind were not abandoned in a panic. They were closed carefully, locked, the icons taken down from the walls and wrapped in cloth, and carried in arms that held them the way you hold something you are not sure you will hold again.
As the days became weeks, the siege changed the texture of the city in ways that were not dramatic, but were, in their accumulation, devastating. Food was not yet scarce in the first weeks, but it was becoming expensive, and the psychological fact of scarcity, the knowledge that the supply was finite and that replenishment was uncertain, changed the way people related to their meals and to each other. Neighbors who had shared bread across a fence for 20 years began to calculate differently. Not maliciously, not yet, but the arithmetic of survival has a way of quietly reassigning loyalties. The defenders on the walls rotated in shifts. The emperor himself appeared among them regularly, riding the length of the Theodosian wall on horseback, speaking to the soldiers in Greek and Italian and whatever other language was needed, demonstrating a presence that was as much theatrical as military. Not because it was dishonest, but because the theater of leadership is inseparable from its substance when men are choosing between courage and flight. The Blackernay Palace, in the northwestern corner of the city, had been the seat of Byzantine imperial power since the 12th century, and it now sat within earshot of the artillery. Constantine had moved from it to various positions along the walls, sleeping where he could, eating with the soldiers, wearing the same armor and the same exhaustion. This was reported through the city by the soldiers who saw him and by the clergy who attended him, and by the officials whose job it was, in part, to manage the morale of a population that was watching its world compress. In the churches, the liturgies grew longer and more intense. The great icon of the Hodegatria, the most sacred Marian image in Constantinople, said to have been painted by St. Luke himself, was carried in procession through the streets on a Tuesday in late April. Thousands lined the route, pressing forward to touch the icon's frame, to speak their prayers aloud or in silence, to receive from this proximity to the holy some reassurance that the protection of the Theotokos was still operative. The procession moved slowly through neighborhoods that smelled of cooking fires and stone dust, and the faint chemical residue of gunpowder that had blown in on the wind from the western walls. Halfway through the procession, the icon was dropped.
The carriers, strong men who had carried it many times before, simply lost their footing, or the crowd pressed too close, or some combination of factors that in ordinary circumstances would have been noted as a minor mishap and quickly corrected. In the circumstances of May 1453, it was received as something else entirely. It was received as a sign. The dropping of the icon was followed within the hour by a sudden and violent hailstorm that struck the procession and scattered it, and then by a dense fog that settled over the city that evening, in a season when fog was uncommon. These events were not coincidental in the minds of the people who experienced them. They were a language. The divine was communicating something, and the question, asked in homes and in the streets and in the narthexes of 100 churches, was what? The most terrifying answer, whispered at first and then spoken openly, was that the protection had been withdrawn, that the sins of the city, unspecified but vast, a collective moral accounting that included the long arguments with Rome over theological union, the violence of the sack of the Genoese merchants by Byzantine mobs 2 centuries before, the individual sins and failures of individual people multiplied by a population that finally had exhausted the patience of the divine, that what was coming was not merely military defeat, but judgment. This interpretation had been prepared for by prophecy. Byzantine culture was saturated with prophetic literature, much of it genuine antiquity and much of it fabricated or retroactively applied, but all of it part of the imaginative furniture that a Byzantine mind used to organize historical experience. There were prophecies that said Constantinople would one day fall to an enemy from the east. There were prophecies that said the fall would happen when the city had accumulated a particular weight of sin. There were counter-prophecies that promised rescue. An angel would descend to the walls. A new Christian emperor from the west would appear. The Ottoman army would be driven back in miraculous confusion. People chose the prophecy that matched the emotional need of the moment. In the days immediately after the icon was dropped, the need was for prophecy that promised rescue, and so those were the ones that circulated most freely. An angel would come. Ships were on the way. Constantine would be taken up like the Emperor Theodosius and preserved to return when the city was redeemed. And there were errors, practical, consequential errors that emerged from this atmosphere of supernatural expectation mixed with genuine desperation. The decision to keep certain gates along the wall inadequately secured because the men assigned to them had been sent elsewhere. The failure to coordinate properly between the Genoese and Venetian contingents, who operated under different command structures and different national loyalties, and who did not always agree about how the defense should be organized. The harbor chain stretched across the Golden Horn to keep the Ottoman fleet from entering, a genuinely brilliant piece of engineering that worked until Mehmed solved it by ordering his ships transported overland on greased logs and relaunched inside the Horn, appearing in waters where Byzantine strategy had assumed they could not appear. When that fleet appeared in the Golden Horn in late April, the psychological impact within the city was severe. The calculation of the siege, which had relied on the security of the harbor and the potential arrival of relief ships through those same waters, shifted in a way that could not be undone by reassurance or prayer. People who had been managing their fear successfully began to feel it differently, not yet as despair, but as a weight that was no longer entirely manageable.
There is a moment in every siege, in every prolonged collective crisis, when the community's ability to hold itself together begins to erode. Not in a single dramatic rupture, but in the accumulation of small failures of trust and solidarity that individually seem manageable, but together represent a fundamental change. In Constantinople in May of 1453, this moment arrived quietly, in the spaces between official proclamations. The unity of the defense had always depended on a consensus that was more fragile than it appeared. The Italian soldiers, the Venetians and Genoese especially, were there because their governments had made commitments and because the specific men who came had their own reasons for being there, reasons that included professional pride and genuine belief in the cause. But they were not Byzantines. They did not share the Byzantine theological conviction that the city was sacred ground and that to die in its defense was to die in a particular proximity to the divine. For them, the siege was also a military calculation, and military calculations have inflection points. Giustiniani, the Genoese commander, who had been the single most effective figure in the wall defense, was wounded on the night of the final assault. The wound's exact nature is disputed by the sources, but its consequence is not. He asked to be carried from the walls. The emperor, who was there, who saw it, who had relied on Giustiniani more than on any other military figure, reportedly asked him to stay. Giustiniani left. His soldiers, seeing their commander being carried away through one of the gates, drew a conclusion from what they saw. The conclusion spread along the wall faster than any official message could travel. Within the city, the loss of confidence expressed itself in ways that were human and therefore complicated. Some people moved toward the Hagia Sophia, instinctively gravitating to the most sacred space in the city, seeking in its vast and luminous interior some final assurance or some final grace. By the early hours of the 29th of May, the church held a crowd that no one had organized, people who had come there not because anyone told them to, but because they did not know where else to go with what they were carrying. Others moved toward the harbor, calculating whether the sea offered what the walls no longer could. The Venetian and Genoese ships that lay in the Golden Horn represented a door that was still for the moment open. Some people reached it, most did not. The emperor, by all accounts, made no attempt to reach it at all. In the weeks before the final assault, the divisions within the city had found voices. The theological question, the union of the Orthodox and Catholic churches, which had been proclaimed at the Council of Florence in 1439 as a condition of Western military support, had never been accepted by the majority of Constantinople's population. The imperial government had formally accepted the union. The Patriarch Gennadius Scalarius had vigorously opposed it. Large segments of the clergy and the laity regarded the union as a capitulation to heresy, a selling of Orthodox truth for the promise of soldiers who had never come. In the atmosphere of the siege, this argument became sharper. The soldiers of Venice and Genoa, however brave and however genuinely committed to the defense, were also living representatives of the Western Church that many Orthodox Byzantines regarded with deep theological suspicion. The social intimacy of the siege, soldiers of different faiths sharing the same walls, the same work, the same danger, produced both moments of genuine solidarity and moments of friction that under ordinary circumstances might have been managed and forgotten. Under these circumstances, they were neither managed nor forgotten. They were remembered and amplified, turned into evidence of a larger pattern, used to explain the siege itself as divine punishment, not merely for the moral failures of individuals, but for the institutional betrayal of Orthodox identity that the Union represented. Better, some said, with a sincerity that is both comprehensible and tragic, to see the turban of Mehmed in the streets of Constantinople than the cardinal's hat of Rome. This was not a position born in the siege. It had a long history in Byzantine theological argument, but the siege gave it an urgency, a bitterness, a final sharpness that made it operative in ways it had not quite been before. The cry for culpability, for some explanation of why this was happening that placed the responsibility somewhere other than on the overwhelming military and demographic and economic superiority of the Ottoman state, found its target in the Latins within the walls, in the emperor's advisors, in anyone who had advocated for accommodation with the West. And this is worth sitting with for a moment, not to judge the people who sought these explanations, because the seeking of explanation in the face of catastrophe is not weakness, but something closer to a definition of what it means to be human, but to notice it, to see in the Constantinople of May 1453 something that recurs in every human community under extreme pressure, the turning inward, the search for the betrayer in the house rather than the enemy at the gate. The final assault began in the small hours of the 29th of May. Mehmed had been preparing for it with a deliberateness that the defenders had been watching but could not fully counter. The previous days had seen intensified artillery fire along the section of the wall where the Lycus ran underground beneath the city, the Mesoteichian, the middle section, where the terrain complicated the defense, and where Urban's cannon had done its most concentrated damage. The breaches had been partially repaired night after night, but the cumulative damage had created a wall that was more patch than substance in certain critical sections. The assault came in waves. The first wave was composed of Bashi Bazouks, irregular troops, fighters from every corner of the Ottoman realm, armed and hungry, but not the elite of the Ottoman military. Their function was not necessarily to break through, but to tire the defenders, to expend their energy and their arrows and their courage against bodies that Mehmed was in a cold military tarvulation prepared to sacrifice. For 2 hours they pressed against the walls and were repulsed, and the defenders, exhausted, vastly outnumbered, but still holding, may have allowed themselves a moment of something like hope. Then the Anatolian regulars came, professionals, equipped and disciplined, pressing with a ferocity and coordination that the irregular assault had not had. For another 2 hours the walls held, and the sound of that holding, the shouting and the metal and the fire and the prayers called out in Greek and Italian, and languages that had no name for each other, reached back into the city and was heard by the people gathered in the Hagia Sophia, and in every church along the Mese. And then Giustiniani was carried away, and a gate was left or found or forced. The sources are not entirely clear, and perhaps the truth is that it was all three at once, the way disasters rarely have a single cause, and the Janissaries came through.
The Janissaries were the elite of the Ottoman army, the soldiers who had been taken as boys from Christian families across the Balkans and raised within the Ottoman system, trained from childhood in the arts of war and the disciplines of obedience. They were extraordinary fighters, and when they came through the breach of the Kirkoporta Gate in the pre-dawn darkness of the 29th of May, the thing that had been holding together for 55 days came apart.
The sound changed. The people in the Hagia Sophia heard it change, felt the shift in the acoustic character of what was coming through the walls and the windows, and they knew what it meant without being told. The chanting continued, the liturgy that had been running through the night, the extraordinary all-night service of prayers and sacraments that the gathered population of Constantinople had been offering in the Hagia Sophia in what had become, though perhaps they did not yet allow themselves to name it this way, a final liturgy continued. Voices kept singing, the incense kept rising. In the streets beyond the church, the Ottoman soldiers were moving through the city with the particular violence of a force that has been held back and is now released. The rules of siege warfare, as understood in that era, were specific. If a city resisted and was taken by force rather than surrendering, it and its population were the property of the conqueror, to be dealt with as the conqueror chose. Mehmed's soldiers chose. 3 days of sack had been promised, and 3 days, or something close to it, is what happened. The people of Constantinople died or did not, hid or could not, surrendered or fled, were enslaved or ransomed in the chaotic and terrible hours that followed the breach. The wealthy had things to offer for their survival, and sometimes this sufficed. The poor had only their lives, and many of those were taken. Churches were stripped of everything that could be carried. Libraries were burned or looted. Manuscripts that were the last copies in the world of texts that had survived 15 centuries were destroyed in hours. The great icon of the Hodegetria disappeared on that day and was never seen again. Constantine XI, the last emperor, died somewhere in the fighting near the walls. No body positively identified as his was ever recovered. He became, in the aftermath, a legend, a story. The emperor who died rather than flee, who threw away his imperial regalia so that he could not be taken as a prize, who fell fighting as an ordinary soldier in the defense of a city that was his identity and his faith and his world. By midday on the 29th, the city had changed hands. By evening, Mehmed II had ridden through the main gate of Constantinople and made his way to the Hagia Sophia. What happened inside the Hagia Sophia when Mehmed entered is described in the sources with a range of detail and a range of sympathy that reflects the positions of those doing the describing. What is generally agreed is that Mehmed ordered a stop to the violence, that whatever remained of the promised 3 days of sack was curtailed by imperial command earlier than the soldiers had anticipated. This was not mercy without calculation. Mehmed wanted a city, not a ruin. He wanted a capital. He was 21 years old, and he had done what he had set out to do. He knelt in the Hagia Sophia and prayed, and then he ordered that the building be converted into a mosque. The bells were removed, the liturgical furniture was cleared, the great mosaics, those images of Christ and the Virgin and the saints that had looked down on 12 centuries of Byzantine worship, were covered, initially with curtains or plaster, awaiting a more permanent concealment. In the days that followed, Mehmed began the work of rebuilding. He understood that an empty Constantinople was useless to him. He needed population, craftsmen, merchants, clergy, administrators. He issued guarantees to the Greek population that remained, promising them the right to continue their religious practice under a patriarch of their own choosing. He repopulated the city with populations from across his empire, establishing the Ottoman Constantinople, Istanbul, that would, within a generation, be one of the largest and most cosmopolitan cities in the world. The survivors of the siege scattered in ways that changed the world they landed in. Byzantine scholars carrying manuscripts fled to Italy, where the texts they brought, the philosophical and literary and scientific inheritance of the ancient world, preserved in Constantinople through the long centuries,
when much of it had been lost in the West, contributed to the intellectual ferment that historians would later call the Renaissance. The fall of Constantinople disrupted the overland trade routes to Asia in ways that intensified the European search for maritime alternatives, accelerating the age of exploration that would, within decades, result in Europeans reaching the Americas and the sea route to India. The world that the fall of Constantinople helped end was also, in its ending, helping to make the next world possible. This is one of history's crueler ironies, that the disasters that close one chapter frequently do so by scattering the seeds of the next. Stand in Istanbul today, on the hill where the Byzantine walls still rise in sections, worn and patched, and somehow still enormous, still possessed of an authority that even their partial ruin cannot diminish, and what you feel is the weight of overlap. Layers of history made visible in stone and silence. The Hagia Sophia, which was a church for 900 years and a mosque for nearly 500 more, and a museum for 80 and a mosque again since 2020, stands as the single most eloquent architectural argument for the complexity of what we inherit from the past. Inside it, the mosaics that were plastered over in 1453 were partially revealed by 20th century restorers, and they now exist in a strange cohabitation with the calligraphic medallions of Islamic text that surround them. Christ and the Virgin looking down from their golden backgrounds, while the names of the prophets and the caliphs claim the arches and the upper walls. It is a building that refuses to simplify. It insists in its layered presence on the truth that history does not erase itself cleanly. It accumulates, it converts and adapts and persists. The stones remember everything. The Byzantines who survived 1453, and many did survive, scattered across the Greek diaspora in Venice and Rome and Crete and across the Mediterranean, carried with them something that could not be looted. They carried a way of understanding the relationship between the human and the divine, between the individual and the community, between the mortal life and the eternal one, that had been shaped by 12 centuries of living at the junction of civilizations. This understanding did not disappear. It dispersed. It entered the bloodstream of the cultures that absorbed it, changing them in ways that were slow and deep and not always recognized as Byzantine in origin. What happened to the person at the window, the one we began with in the dark of the early morning of the 29th of May, is not knowable with precision. There were thousands of such people, and their fates divided along lines of chance and class and the direction they happened to run when the choice was made. Some survived, some did not. Some were enslaved and later freed or ransomed. Some watched from the harbor as the city they had known their entire lives became something else and carried that watching with them to wherever they landed. But what they all shared in those final hours before the world changed was the particular quality of human consciousness that becomes most acute at the edge of catastrophe. The heightened perception of everything ordinary, the sudden and absolute clarity about what was most real, the stripping away of everything that was not essential. The smell of the incense, the weight of a child in your arms, the sound of prayers in a building that was still for a few more hours the most sacred place in the world. The face of someone you loved lit by candlelight in the hours before the dawn. These are not historical abstractions. They are the content of what it means to be a person in any era, in any city, on any ordinary morning that turns out to be the last morning of everything you knew. Constantinople did not simply fall, it transformed, and in transforming, it carried forward in fragments and in echoes and in the long, slow migration of ideas across borders that no conquest can permanently seal, something of what it had been. Every civilization believes at some level that it is eternal, that the walls are strong enough, the faith is pure enough, The identity is ancient enough to outlast whatever is pressing against it from the outside. Constantinople believed this more explicitly and more theologically than most, and Constantinople was wrong. But here is what is also true, and what the stones of Istanbul still whisper to you if you stand among them long enough to hear it. The things that were most worth preserving found ways to survive. Not all of them, not without loss so profound it cannot be fully accounted for, but enough. Enough to change the world that came after. Enough to still be speaking, centuries later, to anyone willing to stand in the right place and listen. The city of Constantine is gone since Tuesday, the 29th of May, 1453. But the sound it made when it fell, that long, resonant falling, that civilizational note struck once and still vibrating, has never entirely stopped. We are still inside that echo.